Hello, I'm ANEKA from Made to Sew and welcome to my princess seam drafting tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to be sharing tips for drafting a princess seam from both the armhole and the shoulder on the front and the back of a garment. Now, I'm going to be working with my free Copen pattern, which you can download if you want to follow along. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to work with your own pattern or your own block. Now, my aim with this tutorial is actually to be able to show you how to make this dress here. This dress came from Copen originally. So, as well as showing you tips for drafting princess seams, I'm going to explain exactly what I did to draft the princess seams that you'll see on this dress here in the front and the back. To join me in this tutorial, you're going to need the pattern that you want to work with, some paper, a nice sharp pencil and a rubber, some pens, and rulers and French curves or any other pattern drafting supplies that you might already have. So collect everything together and we can begin. You need to begin by thinking about your princess seams. Where do you want them to start? Where do you want them to end? Do you want them to come from the shoulder or the armhole? These are decisions that you need to make as a designer, based on the design of the garment that you want and perhaps your individual figure. So, do you want it to come from the shoulder line? If so, you need to think about the placement. Do you want it to start in the centre of the shoulder, or more towards the shoulder, or more towards the neck? This is totally up to you. If you decided that you want to use the shoulder line, you've got to consider whether you want your princess seam to start in the same place on the front and the back of the garment. Again, this is up to you. Consider if you want to use the armhole as the starting point. If you do, where do you want the princess seam to come from? Traditionally, it would start at the centre of the armhole, but you could design for it to come higher or lower. It's really up to you. Once you've decided on the starting point, the shoulder or the armhole, you then want to think about the shape of your princess seam. Do you want it to come right over the apex of the bust, or do you want it to come to the side of the bust? The closer the princess seam travels to the apex of the bust, the more fitted the garment can be. Once you've drafted your princess seams down to the bust, you then want to consider how the princess seam will finish. How will it go to the end of the garment? Will it come to a waist and then stop, or will it go all the way through to the hem of the garment? How will that be positioned? Will it be curved? Will it be straight? Will you come down to the waist and then go straight down? Or will your waist come into the middle a little bit and then you'll go straight out to the hem? There are lots of things to consider here, and it's really down to you as a designer to decide on the look of your finished garment. Also, taking the look at the back of the garment, you need to decide if you want to have princess seams at the back and the front, or perhaps just one or the other. At the back, do you want them to start at the shoulder? Do you want them to start at the armhole? Do you want the placement on the back at the shoulder or armhole to be the same as it is in the front? Or do you want it to be different? Again, how do you want the smooth line of the princess seam to travel down through to the waist and or to the hem of the garment? Consider these placement lines and then join me at the pattern drafting table where I can share how you will actually draft this. Now, I'm working with my free Copen pattern. If you want to work with this pattern and perhaps follow along, then you're welcome to download it. I would, however, recommend that you create a sample garment first as it comes, so that you can check the size that you need to be at the bust, waist and hips. Obviously, you might be a different size across those areas, rather than fitting perfectly into one of the sizes. The pattern comes layered, so you are able to simply print out one size, and that's what I have done here. Obviously, if you're working with your own pattern, that is absolutely fine, or you may even be working with a block, and that's great news. You can still follow along and the same rules will apply. Now, the first thing you need to consider is whether your pattern has seam allowances or hem allowances included. The Copen pattern does. When it comes to pattern cutting, you will always want to pattern cut without seam allowances. This is so that you can be accurate. Then the seam allowances will be added on at the very end, once you have checked a sample garment and you are 100% happy with the pattern that you have cut. Now, if you are a complete beginner, you may find it easier to go ahead and remove the seam allowances from the Copen pattern now. The pattern has 5/8, 1.5 centimetres around the exterior edges, except for the areas that are cut on the fold, and a 3/4 inch, 2 centimetre hem allowance. If you don't want to cut these off, I would at the very least draw them on so that they're nice and clear for you to see. Now, as you can see, I have marked my seam allowances or stitching line onto the garment in a red Sharpie. I wanted it to be really clear to you where the seam allowances were and the part of the pattern that you don't need to consider when you're designing. If you would rather cut them off, then please do so. Let me show you the details of this pattern. Now, this pattern has a side dart and it also has a waist dart here. Don't worry if your pattern doesn't have a waist dart. I will explain as and when you can use this in your princess seam. Now, if your pattern has darts in other places, so perhaps the shoulder, the armhole, or along the front edge of the garment, you may or may not want to move them across to form a side dart. You will see as the tutorial continues that we will actually remove the side dart so that we have a nice smooth side panel when it comes to our princess seam. So I will be filming a tutorial in the coming weeks on dart manipulation, which will show you how to move your darts around a pattern to change the design lines. You will need to use that tutorial to move any darts that you don't want into your side panel so that you can then get rid of them like I'm going to show you in this tutorial. The other useful bit of information that I have on this pattern is a clear bust marking. It's got a horizontal and vertical line which shows exactly where the apex or the fullest part of the bust is. Your pattern may have a circle with a cross in it, or it may just be a horizontal line. Unfortunately, when it's a horizontal line, it isn't as clear as to where the exact apex of the bust is. We're only going to know horizontally which plane the bust is sitting. Let's begin by discussing the placement of our princess seams. I did show you this briefly on the mannequin. So, to start with, think about whether you want your princess seam to start in the shoulder or in the armhole. If you want it to start in the shoulder, now we have removed our seam allowances, or you've drawn them on, you can clearly see where your options are. Do you want it to start in the centre of the shoulder, or closer to the shoulder edge, or closer to the neck edge? It is up to you as the designer. When it comes to the armhole again, we have got a variety of locations where we can start the princess seam. We could start it in the middle, closer to the underarm, or higher up towards the shoulder. Again, your choice as the designer. Then when it comes to the bust point, we've got the decision as to whether we want the princess seam to run straight over the fullest part of the bust, or whether we want to move that over to the side of the bust slightly. Again, totally up to you. Now I'm going to show you a couple of different princess seam lines and the rules or methods you need to apply with the different lines. It allows you to go away with lots of content and be able to design the princess seam that you want. Now I'm going to begin by showing you how to draft the princess seam that you saw at the start of the tutorial, the red dress. Now, this princess seam comes from the armhole. It's up to you where you want to position the princess seam, but I started it at this notch in the armhole here. Now, I'm going to be working with Sharpies throughout this tutorial, but you will do all of your drafting with a nice sharp pencil. The only reason I'm using Sharpie is so that you can clearly see what I'm doing. So with the red dress, the princess seam began at the notch in the armhole. It then travelled to the end of your dart. So this isn't a very fitted princess seam. And part of the reason I did this is because I didn't use the waist dart. So we came to the end of the dart here, and then I took a straight line through to the hem of the dress top, whatever it is you're making. Now, one of the key things when it comes to princess seams is drawing smooth lines, because that will make it easier for you to sew them. So I will use my French curve, and I will aim here to get a nice shape between the notch and end of the dart here at the bust. And I can draw that in. And I'm going to do this in my Sharpie. I'm going to do it in my blue. Just like so. Now, when I've got to the end of my dart here, I want to bring this line down towards the waist. And as I said, I wanted to do that in quite a straight manner. I didn't want to use my waist dart, so I just wanted to bring it down nice and straight through the waist and to the hem. So I'm actually going to take a straight line from the end of the dart all the way through to the hem of the dress. And it can be a top you're making or a dress, it's up to you. Now I'm making sure that my ruler, or the horizontal lines on my ruler, are actually parallel to the hem of the top, the dress, and the lengthen and shorten lines. So I'm taking a nice square line all the way down. And again, I'm going to do this in pencil first because I've got a little bit of a kink here now over the front of the dart. So I'm going to need to pick my ruler up again and just smooth that bit off. Just like so. And I will draw that in for you. There you go. So you will see that obviously when I'm working with a Sharpie, it looks a little bit messier, but when I'm working with a pencil, I might do a slight curve, and it might be that my French curve won't actually get me all the way from the start to the end of the princess line that I want. Therefore, I will have to do a part of the curve, then maybe go to my straight ruler, do a little bit more, and then maybe come back to the curve. And because you're working with a nice sharp pencil and a rubber, you can obviously rub out any of the bits you don't want at the end, and then go over your final line. So now we've drawn on the design line that we want. We will need to do a few things before we trace or cut these two pieces apart. We need to add our grain lines, we need to add our notches, and we need to label the pieces. So let's start with the grain lines. Well, we already have a cut on fold grain line here. That came on this piece of the pattern. I am still planning on having my front cut on the fold, so I'm going to leave this as it is. Or perhaps I'll go over it in blue for you to see. So our cut on fold line is nice and clear along this edge, but in a second, when we either trace off the two pattern pieces, we're going to be left with a centre front and a side front. And the side front doesn't have a grain line, so we would be guessing. So what we're going to do is to position a grain line on now before we separate the pieces. We want the grain line on the side front to be parallel to the centre front of our garment. So all we need to do here is to measure across from the centre front. I am making sure that the lines on my ruler are parallel to the centre front line. And I've just picked a number, say 6 inches is what I'm on. I'm going to draw a little mark there, and then I will go up and again do another mark at 6. And you could do this a couple of times if you wanted to. You can now connect those lines, and you can draw this as long as you like, all the way down, and that gives us our grain line. So we have a grain line on the side front, we have a grain line on the centre front. We have labelled the pieces, centre front, side front. We now need some notches. These are going to help us to sew the pieces together, or this princess seam, when we're actually sewing it. So what we're going to do is to position a notch along the waistline. Now on my pattern I have a nice marking here that says waistline. Hopefully you will have something as well. Otherwise you can pick something that's near the waist. Again, I make sure that my notches are parallel to my centre front in this instance, because the line here, the princess seam line, is also parallel to the centre front. The notches that I draw will be about 1/4 inch, 5mm long. And I'm just going to draw it straight through. And you can either draw them as straight lines, you can put little ends on the line so that you know that they're notches, whatever works best for you. You can draw triangles if you like. As well as a notch at the waist, you're also going to want to position a notch further up the princess seam. And I tend to do this 2 inches, 5 centimetres from the start. I will measure down approximately 2 inches or 5 centimetres, and then I'm going to position a notch that is at 90 degrees to my stitching line, just like so. Okay, so I now have notches that I need, and I've done 1 notch because this is the front of the garment. Notches generally build up as you go around the garment. Now, you have the option here to either simply use a pair of scissors to cut along your blue line. The blue line is the line of our princess seam, our new stitching line. Or you can take some tracing paper, just like this nice thick tracing paper that I use, and trace out the 2 pieces. If you were tracing, you would be tracing the red line. You can add the seam allowance on if you want to, but I would trace your stitching line as well. The blue line, the notches, the darts, all the way down for your side front, and then your centre front would be the same. You don't need to worry about the dart here because we are ignoring it in this technique. It's really up to you which method you prefer. If I have a pattern perhaps that I've made some other amendments to, so say this Copen pattern I had done some other bits and it was my only one, then I would probably leave it as a master pattern and just have these on here as design lines and trace them off to make the real pattern. But if you have numerous patterns that you were printing off like I've done here, then I can cut it up. So that's what I'm going to be doing now. I'm going to take a pair of scissors and I'm starting right at the bottom of the dress because I've drawn this all the way down for a dress, and I'm cutting up the blue line all the way. And you will see as I cut between the notches that it creates a notch on both pieces, and they will correspond when we're sewing together. And then I'm going to go all the way through the seam allowance as well, just like so. Now this is quite a smooth curve here, so we haven't got any sort of angles that I need to trim off with my scissors. If you did have any little points or peaks, please do just trim them off with the scissors so that it makes a nice smooth finish to your stitching line. Now you will need to remember that these 2 edges do not have seam allowances added. We will be doing that shortly. But what we do need to do our side front piece is to remove this dart, because we do not want to have a dart here. The whole point in us drafting a princess seam is to remove the side dart. So what we are going to do is to cut along one of the dart legs. It does not matter which you use. And you will cut all the way to the edge of the paper, but not through, just leaving a tiny little bit of paper as a pivot at the end there. Then you're going to slide the lines to meet on the dart, just like so. And you can tape it closed. Now let's look at drafting a princess seam from the shoulder. Again, you can decide on the placement at the shoulder, but for this I'm going to go with the centre. So I've measured my shoulder and I found the centre of the shoulder, and I've put a little mark there. Now for this technique I'm going to be going straight to my bust point. And I could do this with a straight line, I could do this with a slight curve. What I want to be showing you with this technique is that the dart doesn't go all the way to the point or the apex of the bust. So I'm going to show you what you would do in those circumstances. I'm also going to show you what you would do if you wanted to include your waist dart in this seam to make a more fitted garment. So I will pick up my curve and I will have a look. So using my curve, I'm going to draft a nice smooth line. And the key here is to remember that the line that you draw onto your pattern piece is the line that will be sewn in your final garment. So you can see from the shoulder, I've curved through to my bust apex, and then I have created a very slight curve all the way down and through to the hem of the dress or top, whichever it is that you're making. And as I said, this line here doesn't have to be straight. You can curve towards the centre front at the waist and back away to the side seam at your hem. Just keep in mind that smooth lines do look better. So, with this garment, I want to sew, or I want to include the dart. I want this to be more fitted than the other example I was showing you. So what are the rules that you need to apply in those circumstances? Generally speaking, I want my centre front panel, which is from my blue line across to the front here, to follow as it currently is with the line that I have drawn. It will be the side panel that will curve. I will show you how to remove the dart in a second. The waist dart is also going to be removed. So what we're going to do is to take that away from the side panel. We need to change the side front to remove the dart. Now, this obviously depends on where you drew your seam line in the blue. So where you want that seam to be and how close to the waist dart you are. At the top here, I'm really close to my dart line. So I'm going to use the green pen to show where the side front panel is going to be. I can simply follow this side of the dart until we get to about here. And the reason I can do that is because the blue line is on the other side of the dart. Now at this point, there's a little bit of dart that is creeping in to my centre front panel. It's approximately 1/8 or 2 millimeters. So what I need to do is at the same point, I need to increase this side of the dart. So I'm moving it over to make sure that that largest part of the dart measures the same. We've gained a bit in the centre front, so therefore I need to remove a bit in the side front. So the amount of dart that will be sewn or that is disappearing in the seam is the same amount. Now, as we go further down, you can see that the dart has actually moved away from the centre front or the seam line that I've drawn. So what I need to do here is to move it back. So the point of the dart I could position onto my seam line, and then I could draw a straight line from the widest part to the point. If you have drawn a very curved seam between the side front and the centre front that you're going to be sewn as your princess seam, I wouldn't just pick a line from the widest part to the point of the dart. Instead, I would work my way down, measuring each point, checking that the dart or the amount that's going to be cut away of the dart is correct and it's in the correct horizontal position. So you can use a ruler and line it up with the centre front, and you can say at this point my dart should measure 1/2 inch, 1 inch, whatever it might be, 2 centimetres, whatever it might be, and then make sure that that same amount is positioned between the blue line, so the edge of your centre front, and the green line, the edge of your side front. That just makes it sure that it's really accurate if you have a very curved line. I'm going to draw my side piece in there. So you can see that is the dart. It has just been stuck to the centre front piece. So I have now drawn the green line, which is the edge of the side front panel. The dart in here measures exactly the same as it did originally. It has just been moved ever so slightly so that it is positioned between the centre front and the side front. So if I use my red pen to show you, this part is not going to be used or sewn. It's going to be cut away in a second. Let me show you how to do that while this is still clear in your mind. So I have got a pair of scissors, and what I'm going to do now is to separate my pattern pieces. So I'm going to separate the centre front from the side front, and I'm going to cut up that blue line that we drew, because that is the line that we want to appear as the princess line on our new garment. All the way through at the top as well. So we have separated our pieces. We have our centre front and we have our side front. And we cut down the blue line, so that's the design line that we drafted for the princess seam, from the shoulder through the bust point all the way down to the hem. And I've just cut this off at a top length so that it's easier for you to see. You would just keep going down to the base if you were doing the dress. Now let's take a look at this dart. So hopefully you can now see the green line, which is the edge of our side front panel. What we need to do there is to cut away that amount of dart, and that is going to remove the dart when we sew this so that it is as fitted as it were if you were sewing a dart in the dress. So there we go. That is the piece of dart, and we now have our side front panel. Now you will see this is quite angled in a few locations along here. So just use your scissors and smooth this off a little bit. You don't want any sort of peaks or anything. Nice smooth lines, please. Just like I mentioned with the first princess seam, if you would have rather traced these off than cut them out, you're more than welcome to do that. You will also see that I have notches, again 2 inches down, which is 5 centimeters down from the shoulder and at the waist, just like I did with the first princess seam, and grain lines on both pieces. Now the next step is to remove the dart on the side panel. This is going to be the same technique that I showed you with the first princess seam. However, there is one difference, and that's that the seam doesn't actually hit the end of the dart. So what are we going to do? We are going to take a ruler and our Sharpie, and I'm going to work with the green Sharpie because this is the side front, and I'm going to draw a line from the bust point that I can just see there to the end of the dart leg. And you want this to be a straight line. And the same for the other dart leg. So we're sort of redrawing the dart in, and it may change its position ever so slightly, but it allows us to completely remove the dart from the side front piece. Just like you would have done with Princess Seam 1, we're going to cut along one of the dart legs. It does not matter which. You're going to cut all the way along until you get to the edge of the piece of paper, and then you will cut just not through. So you're leaving a smidgen of paper joining along that edge. That allows us to pivot the piece of paper closed. And then we can stick that down. Make sure that you're accurately doing that. If you have a little bit of discrepancy on the side, don't worry about that. We will sort that out in a second. There we go. Now it's starting to come together. We've got our centre front piece with our design line. We have got our side front piece, the dart, side dart has been removed, and our waist dart has been removed. And I'm going to scrap that a little bit now. We've got the grain lines on both. The centre front is going to be cut on the fold, so the grain line is already on there. Added a grain line onto here, and we have got notches at just below the shoulder and at the waist point. Next step is going to be to true the pattern together. We're going to need to true the seam that we have created here for the princess seam. And also you may have a little bit of truing to do on the side here where the dart is. We also must not forget that we have no seam allowances on this seam. So we will need to be adding seam allowances. Both the truing and the adding of the seam allowances is the same for both of the princess seams that I've shown you. So I'm only going to show this once. Then we'll take a look at the back and the princess seam options on the back of the garment. Now once you've separated your pattern pieces, trace them off, cut them out, whatever you've wanted to do, the final thing you're going to need to do is to what's called true the seam. Now truing the seam means that we are checking that this seam of the side front is going to fit this seam of the centre front. It sounds like a bit of a stupid thing to say, seeing as we just cut the pattern pieces apart. However, by manipulating the dart away and by creating quite a curve on the side front compared to the centre front, you can find there is a big difference with the seams. For example, these two pattern pieces are actually quite straight. There isn't a massive curve here. But to show you what I would do, I would take a tape measure and I would measure right on the edge. Because we haven't got a seam allowance on here yet, whenever I'm measuring a curve, I always measure with the tape measure upright like so. You would measure from the start to the notch. Now this should measure the 2 inches, 5 centimetres that we planned, because that's what we did, and that is correct. You would then measure from the waist notch down to the base of the garment. And it is correct on this one. I've already done it. And then you would measure notch to notch and compare the figures. Write them down if you need to and make sure they are the same. Now I've already gone ahead and done it with this one and I know that it is the same. The reason is because it isn't overly curved. If you didn't want to use the tape measure to measure, the other way to do this is by actually abutting the pieces of paper and what's called walking them together. So as the curve changes, you will need to swivel and walk the pieces. And you can see that they still go together pretty much perfectly. It might be a smidgen out, but that's fine. Let's have a look at our second example because that had much more curve built into it because we also took the waist dart. Again, looking at this pattern, you're going to want to measure the seam or walk them together from the hem to the waist, between the notches, and from the shoulder to the notch. And record the figures and if there are any differences. Now, what are the rules when it comes to the differences between this seam? There are lots of different schools of thought about whether there should be ease or shouldn't be ease in a princess seam. In my opinion, most of the time I will draft my princess seams so that they match, so that there isn't any difference between the side front and the centre front. However, depending on fabric and on occasions where perhaps my side front is very curved, I may have a little bit of ease. The maximum I would be happy with is 1/4 inch to 3/8, so 6 millimeters to 1 centimeter. But the majority of the time I will draft them flush. It's again something to check when you're making up your first sample garment. So the question you probably have is how do you make any amendments if the two seams don't match? We're going to add them into the side front because that's usually where you will be adding it. If the discrepancy was between the two notches, you would want to make the adjustment at the bust area. You want to make sure that you take a horizontal line at the bust area that is parallel or at 90 degrees to the grain line. You would then take a pair of scissors and cut from the new princess seam along the line that you've just drawn through to the stitching line. You don't want to cut any further than the stitching line. And you would be adding in any adjustment into here. Now, to let this lie flat, you're going to need to snip into the other end. So snip into the seam allowance, but not through the stitching line. And that will allow you to create a pivot point at your stitching line there to insert the amount that you need here. If the discrepancy was between the waist and the hem, I would recommend drawing again a horizontal line that is at 90 degrees to your grain line, approximately 1 inch, 2 to 3 centimeters down from your waist, and you would complete the same technique. We also want to look at any discrepancy along this side seam here, because of how the dart was folded. Now you want to use a ruler or a French curve depending on the shape that you have got, and you simply just want to blend that in nice and smoothly. It should only be a very small amount that you're having to change this by. Once you've drawn on your new stitching line, please bear in mind that you may also need to increase or decrease or simply amend the edge of your seam allowance here. So measure out from your new stitching line your seam allowance. In my case, it's 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimeters. Finally, once you've trued the seam, you're going to need to add seam allowances. You will need the seam allowances to the new design line or your new princess seam, and you will also need to add them everywhere else if you had decided to remove them. So I've got a bit of scrap paper underneath there, and I generally start by sticking on some scrap paper, and you just need to have enough paper for your seam allowances. So I will stick that on both the side front and the front all the way down to the hem. Then I will grab ruler and pencil, and I will work to add back on my 5/8. If you don't like using rulers like this, then you could also try using a tape measure. My tape measure actually measures 5/8, 1.5 centimeters. Do check that yours does measure it before you use it. And you can buy seam gauges as well, and they're quite useful. So whichever method you prefer to add your seam allowances back on. And obviously you'll be adding what your seam allowance is, because it might be different to mine. So I would do it to my side front, and I would also do it to my center front. To make that nice and clear for you, I have gone in and drawn it with my red Sharpie and also sort of shaded out the seam allowance areas. So you can see that I've clearly got seam allowance on my side front and my center front. Now I would need to cut these out along my red lines so that the seam allowances remained attached to the pieces. Let's also look at the back of the pattern. Now the back of the pattern isn't as complicated as the front because of the dart and bust shaping, but we may want to consider a few things on the back. The first one is the placement of your design lines. Are you going to go to the armhole? Where do you want to place it in the armhole? Do you want it to be the same as it is in the front, slightly higher? It's really up to you. The same for the shoulder. Do you want it to match? If you've done it at the shoulder on the front, will it be in the center of the shoulder like it was on the front, or will it be different? Again, all of your choices. So let's start by looking at what I did on the red dress. For the red dress, I actually started at the notches again, and I went with the second notch. And that was the beginning of the princess seam. Now, when it comes down the back, You don't have a bust marking like you had in the front, but we can consider where you want the princess seam to be at the waist. Think about the position from the armhole down through the waist and to the hem of the garment. Do you want it to come into the centre back and then back towards the side at the hem, producing quite a curved seam? Or do you want a straighter seam? Do you want to involve the dart just like we did in the front or not? It's really up to you. Now for the red dress, I didn't involve the dart, just like I didn't involve the dart in the front of the red dress. And I simply used a smooth shape from the notches down to the waist, something like this. And then, just like I did in the front, I picked up a straight line from the waist, making sure that my ruler or the lines on my ruler are parallel with my hem and my waistline. And I continued that all the way down to the hem. And that is the princess seam shape that I did on the red dress. I'm going to draw that in the blue Sharpie for you. Now, if you wanted to create a back pattern piece that matched the second princess seam we did in the front, you would need to find a point at the centre of the shoulder, just like we did with the front, and then you would come down again close to the waist dart, because that's what we did on the front, and you would do exactly the same technique as we did on the front to include the waist dart into the side panel, because as with the front, this seam here is going to be the straight line, the nice smooth line, and the side panel is the one that will be shaped with the dart. So I will label these side back and centre back. I will again add my grain lines, and my grain lines will again on both pieces be in line with the current grain line, which is in line with the centre back. I'm again exactly what I did in the front, just measuring across from the current grain line and drawing that on. And then I will also need some notches. Again, the top notch is going to be 2 inches or 5 centimetres down from either the armhole or the shoulder, wherever you started. Now I'm going to do 2 notches here in both locations so that it's nice and clear that these are the back pieces of my pattern. So as I said before, notches increase in number as they travel around the body. Very easy compared to the front. We would then either trace off or we would cut along the blue line, we would add our seam allowances and we would true it, just as we have done in the front. The final thing that you will need to do is to true the side front to the side back using the same method that I showed you for the princess seams. Obviously you haven't really changed anything here, but you always want to check to be 100% sure that you are happy with the changes that you have made. You could have a little bit of discrepancy from any amendments to the side front dart there. I always recommend truing 100% of your seams and then making up a sample garment. It allows you to check that you're happy with the design lines that you have drafted and added onto the pattern. Then you will be sure that you will love your new garment when it's made. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and that you now feel a little more confident when it comes to doing some pattern drafting and making this dress. Join me on Sunday for the tutorial on how to sew princess seams together. Thanks for watching and see you soon.